During the small hours of the 3rd of June, under a fog-dimmed summer twilight, Admiral Kakuta's second mobile force, 2 light carriers, 2 heavy cruisers and a destroyer screen made its fast run-in toward Dutch Harbour. By good luck, aided by Aleutian weather, Kakuta eluded the search planes that had been out all night looking for him, and also penetrated the line of picket boats without being detected. His launching position, 165 miles south of Dutch Harbour, was reached around 2:50. But, by the same token, the Japanese carrier planes had difficulty with their navigation. Many straggled, and Junyo's attack group turned back halfway to the target. Ryujo's, which got through 9 bombers and 3 fighter planes, found fine weather with a 10,000-foot cloud ceiling over Dutch Harbour. The radar of seaplane tender Gillis detected their approach at 5:40. She and the other ships present went to general quarters and made haste to get underway and stand out to sea, but none were able to clear the harbour until the attack was over. Owing to fair weather over Dutch Harbour, Ryujo planes had no difficulty in finding targets: the tank farm, radio station, army barracks at Fort Mears, and moored Catalinas. In a period of 20 minutes, starting shortly after 8:07, they inflicted considerable damage and terminated about 25 soldiers and sailors, but lost one of their number to anti-aircraft fire, which they described as powerful. One of the attacking planes sighted 5 destroyers of Commander Craig's striking group in Makushin Bay and radioed the information to Admiral Kakuta. This gave the Admiral a new target for the second strike, launched about 9. Weather now favoured the defence, and not one plane found the destroyers at Makushin Bay. Moreover, one group had an unpleasant surprise when it flew over Otter Point, Umnak. 2 Army P-40s attacked, shot down 2 Japanese planes and damaged 2 more irreparably. The new Otter Point Airfield was concealed by overcast, and Kakuta's intelligence officers could not imagine where they were based. Carriers and cruisers closed to a distance of 130 miles south of Dutch Harbour to recover, and around noon commenced retirement on a southwesterly course. As yet only one American plane, a PBY, had sighted them, although many had been searching assiduously, and the PBY contact report, made on the 2nd of June, was inaccurate. Captain Geres, commander of the naval planes at Dutch Harbour, believed that the carriers were operating in the Bering Sea. Admiral Theobald's main body, in the meantime, was about 500 miles SSE of Kakuta's position. The Admiral was becoming more and more restive and angry. He was receiving radio news, most of it bad, but the rule of radio silence precluded his giving any orders outside visual signalling distance. The enemy had 2 strikes on him, yet nobody could find the enemy. During the evening of the 4th of June, after receiving word of the second day's strike on Dutch Harbour, he could stand it no longer, peeled off from his main body in Nashville and headed for Kodiak. Admiral Kakuta fueled his destroyers during the night and changed course for Adak, which Yamamoto had ordered him to soften up. Day brought a fog mull so thick that he had to cut speed to 9 knots. His meteorologists predicted worse weather to the westward, but promised good visibility over Dutch Harbour. So the Admiral decided to cancel the Adak strike and pay a second visit to Dutch Harbour. Thick weather again enabled him to elude all search planes and picket boats. At the 16th of June 4, Ryujo and Junyo commenced launching an attack group of 11 dive bombers, 6 Kates for high-level bombing, and 15 fighters. During their absence, the second mobile force was at last detected by American search planes, and several Army bombers were sent out to grope for it in the fog and mist. They found the carriers, but got nothing better than near misses. A B-26 and a B-17 were shot down. The Japanese carrier planes, moreover, enjoyed their previous good luck in finding fair weather over the target. 4 new 6,666 barrel fuel tanks and their contents were destroyed, 1 wing of the hospital was demolished, an uncompleted hangar damaged, the beached barracks ship Northwestern partially destroyed, and the death list raised to 43. But only repeated bombings could have knocked out Dutch Harbour as an operating base, and this was the last. Before returning to their carrier, the Junyo pilots rendezvoused over the western cape of Unalaska, whence their startled gaze beheld the new landing field at Otter Point, Umnak. This was the first that any Japanese knew of an American airfield in the Aleutians. 8 of Major John Chennault's P-40s, based there, shot down 3 planes from Juneau. But by the end of this day, the Navy had lost 6 of its 20 PBYs, and the AAF contingent was -3 bombers and 2 P-40s. More disturbing to Admiral Kakuta than the discovery of the Umnak Airfield were the radio dispatches he received from Admiral Yamamoto while his planes were still in the air. In quick succession, around 1600, Kakuta's force was ordered south to rendezvous with Nagumo, and the occupation of the western Aleutians as well as of Midway was temporarily postponed. It was not difficult for Kakuta to infer that Nagumo had taken a beating off Midway and wanted his light carriers. At the same time, Yamamoto ordered the powerful Aleutian screening force, which had been detached the 3rd of June to support Kakuta, back to his main body. Yamamoto's vacillation did not last long. At 19:30 June 4th, less than 4 hours after the temporarily postponed order, he informed Commander Northern Area Force by radio that the occupation of the western Aleutians must go on as planned. The Kiska and Attu occupation forces, which had cheerfully turned back toward Japan after a week of very rough, foul, and bitterly cold weather, now reversed course. And before Kakuta had gone more than halfway to the southern rendezvous, he too was turned around. At the 15th of June, 5th Mobile Force was ordered, returned to the northern force. For even though the big game off Midway had been lost, there was no reason why the junior team up north should not win a consolation prize. Instead of going north again, Kakuta's force, to the great relief of its members, was directed to a standby area some 600 miles SSW of Kiska, where it rendezvoused with Admiral Hosogaya in Nachi. With the Northern Area Force commander was an oiler group, and some of the capital ships originally destined for Midway were transferred to his command by Yamamoto in the expectation that a United States force might come that way. Although Hosogaya's Northern Area Force had become far stronger than heretofore, it was now as much out of the picture as Theobald's main body. Kakuta was ordered to move north on the 12th of June to try to intercept American planes attacking Kiska, but Aleutian weather muffled both ships and planes, and a few days later all Japanese forces retired. The American sailors would have been very much pleased to have had this information. Patrol planes out of Dutch Harbour were being run ragged. Captain Parker, who represented Admiral Theobald ashore, sent a dispatch on the 7th of June to Admiral Nimitz that continuous operation of the Catalinas was resulting in losses without being followed by successful attacks and compensating damage to the enemy, who appeared to be operating with impunity, both in and out of bombing range. He believed that the islands were in grave danger unless more planes, whether land-based or carrier-based, were sent up immediately. This dispatch produced a prompt reinforcement of the air forces in the Aleutians, but not in time to affect the result. The discovery by Juneau pilots of the new Otter Point Airfield on Umnak may have had some influence on Japanese movements, although not nearly so much as most Americans supposed at the time. Several popular commentators, assuming that the enemy intended to take Dutch Harbor and proceed to the Alaskan mainland, credited the Umnak-based P-40s with frustrating the entire operation. A writer in Reader's Digest even declared that, by that slim chance we saved Alaska, that but for the P-40s, the Japanese would have been running Alaska from the governor's house in Juneau by 1943. That comforting theory was excellent for the morale of the Army Air Force in the Aleutians, which, not for want of gallantry or zeal, but for lack of appropriate training and fair weather, made not a single hit on an enemy ship during the 9 days of the campaign. But it had no basis, in fact. Admiral Hosogaya, who was responsible for the decision to give up taking Adak, may have thought that Umnak was too close 350 miles to Adak for safety. Since, in any event, Adak was only to be occupied by an advance detachment in the smaller transport, and a possible cancellation had been anticipated in Hosogaya's operation plan, this change was unimportant. Rear Admiral Omori, commander of the Adak Attu occupation force, was ordered by Hosogaya early on the 5th of June, when about 225 miles southwest of Adak, to turn back and proceed to Attu. That he did, and landed his 1,200 troops on the morning of the 7th of June, after some unnecessary minesweeping and a beach reconnaissance at dawn in thick fog. They landed on Holt's Bay and marched overland through snow to Chichagof. The main part of the detachment got lost and made Massacre Bay by mistake. Although the Japanese blamed this on poor maps, their performance was lamentable. A few hundred Marines could have thrown them back easily. Chichagof was attacked, and the entire population, 39 Aleuts and Mr. and Mrs. Jones, was taken prisoner. According to the Japanese, their transports, when unloading in the morning of the 8th of June, were attacked without success by a United States submarine. Unloading of all equipment was completed on the 10th. The Kiska occupation force, augmented by a seaplane carrier and destroyer from Omori's group, proceeded according to plan. That landing, too, was made on the 7th of June without opposition from the 10 members of the temporary United States weather station. This was not the last time that a fully equipped amphibious force landed on Kiska and found no enemy to fight. Kiska, as we have seen, was to have been the northern anchor of the new defence chain. Lacking Midway, it was now useless for that purpose. The High Command nevertheless decided to keep Kiska and develop it as an airbase, partly as a block to invasion, partly for nuisance and morale value. The Japanese people, who heard few facts about Midway, were gratified to learn that the rising sun was flying over 2 more American islands, and, by the same token, the occupation of Kiska and Attu took some of the relish out of the news of Midway in the United States. The American planes based at Umnak, Dutch Harbour and Cold Bay lost touch with Kakuta's force after its retirement on the 4th of June. Persistent efforts were made during the next few days to regain contact, but the Japanese ships were no longer within air range. Early on the 5th of June, a completely false contact report by a patrol plane misled everyone on the American side. 2 large carriers, 2 heavy cruisers, and 3 destroyers were reported to be steaming toward Dutch Harbour from a point in the Bering Sea. Every available plane was sent out to search and attack, but without result, no wonder, since no such force existed outside the pilot's imagination. This false contact was doubly unfortunate because Admiral Theobald, already beginning to suspect the truth that the Dutch harbour strikes had been diversionary, and that no landing in that area was intended, now felt that his earlier estimate of enemy intentions was confirmed. This was it. Admiral Nimitz, too, was affected by the false contact report into making the plan we have already noted to send Enterprise and Hornet to rendezvous with Saratoga, take on replacement planes, and proceed north to engage the Japanese carriers. Admiral Theobald came ashore again at Kodiak early on June 8th to confer with his group commanders and make plans for the destruction of both Kakuta's force and the hypothetical one. He then returned to his usual operating area south of Kodiak, where, on the 10th, he learned that Enterprise and Hornet were not coming north after all, and that the enemy had occupied Kiska and Attu. Words fail us, though they did not fail the Admiral for expressing the exasperation that he felt at this juncture. Now convinced that he could not control events from a ship at sea, he came ashore for keeps a few days later, setting up his headquarters at Kodiak. Captain Geres at Dutch Harbour, fearing the worst when reports from American weather observers in Kiska and Attu ceased to come in on 8 and the 9th of June, moved Tender Gillis up to Atikea Island, halfway to Kiska, in order to place his patrol planes within shorter range OI the Western Islands. On the afternoon of the 10th, one of his Catalinas reported 4 ships in Kiska Harbour and a tent colony on Attu. This was the first news received on the American side of the Japanese landings that had taken place 3 days earlier. Admiral Nimitz, promptly notified, ordered the submarine group, which as yet had made no significant contacts, to move into the Western Aleutians, and ordered Captain Geres to bomb the Japanese out of Kiska. For 48 hours, beginning the 11th of June, the PBYs did their best. They used Tender Gillis at Nazan Bay, Atikea, as a staging point, and worked their crews to the point of exhaustion. General Butler's heavy army bombers based at Cold Bay staged through Otter Point and attacked too, but none of these strikes had any deterrent effects on enemy activities in Kiska. On the contrary, they stimulated a counterattack on Gazan Bay, the 14th of June, by the Japanese flying boats that had been moved from Paramushiro to Kiska. Captain Geres, warned in time by intelligence, pulled Gillis out before the planes came in. Thus, the Aleutians part of the Great Midway operation may be said to have ended in mid-June with a minor Japanese victory, the occupation of 2 islands of little except nuisance value. A new phase may be said to have begun on the 11th of June, the Japanese trying to hold what they had, and the Americans trying to blast them out. And in this new phase, the Army Air Force started bombing and sinking transport Nissan Maru off Kiska on the 18th of June. The Aleutians battle, like Midway, was a contest of air power, in which weather consistently aided the offensive by shrouding ships in a protective mist, while sweeping land targets clear. One naturally speculates what might have happened if Admiral Theobald had believed the intelligence report received on the 28th of May, which gave the real Japanese objectives, and if he had moved west. The outcome of a battle between his cruiser force, supported only by land-based air, and Kakuta's carrier and cruiser force would have been largely a matter of luck, depending on the weather. If land-based planes could have neutralized Junyo and Ryujo, Theobald's superior gun power might have won, but considering that during the entire course of the war no Japanese carrier was hit by a PBY, a B-26 or a B-17, the chance of such a hit in the Alaskan weather of June 1942 was negligible. It was probably fortunate that Theobald operated well out of harm's way, and that his 5 cruisers were saved for distinguished fighting careers later in the war. It is certainly fortunate that Admiral Nimitz recalled Enterprise and Hornet instead of sending them westward, for by the 12th of June Hosogaya, operating south of Kiska, had been reinforced by the big carrier Zuikaku, light carrier Zuibo, 2 battleships and 4 heavy cruisers. That deployment was Yamamoto's last effort to trap Spruance and reverse the fortunes of Midway. Admiral Theobald, however, deserved a better fate than to have his reputation smothered in northern mists. Mechanically minded Americans early conceived the idea of a ship travelling under the water. In the nation's infancy, Bushnell and Fulton produced workable submarine boats, and during the Civil War various submersible contraptions were used by both sides. The invention of the diesel engine and the storage battery enabled inventors Holland and Lake, with Navy encouragement, to transform the submarine from the experimental gadget of a weak sea power to the practical weapon of a major sea power. Despite an uninspiring record in World War I, when not a single sinking was credited to an American submarine, the United States Navy went right on experimenting and building, confident that undersea warships would be wanted if the nation ever went to war again. By the 7th of December 1941, there were 55 large and 18 medium-sized submarines in the Asiatic and Pacific fleets, out of a total of 111 in the entire Navy, not counting 73 under construction. These were to be one of the most decisive weapons of the Pacific War. Nearly 1/3 of all Japanese combat ships destroyed were their victims, and no less than 63% of Japanese merchant tonnage sunk was accounted for by the American undersea boats. As the silent service operated under conditions of highest secrecy, few stories of its exploits were given out, and no correspondent was taken to sea before 1945. This policy of secrecy was both wise and necessary. The contrary German policy of publicizing U-boats hurt them in the end. But to this day, secrecy has deprived American submariners of the credit they deserve. During the first 4 months of the war, these ships fought doggedly under great handicaps against a confident and aggressive enemy. The Asiatic submarine bases with invaluable supplies and spare parts were lost. Intelligence of enemy ship movements was scant. Too many torpedoes proved to be duds. Pre-war doctrines emphasized caution. Beleaguered garrisons demanded messenger boy missions far from fruitful hunting grounds. Skippers were untried in combat, and the less skillful and aggressive were not yet weeded out. Although Japanese shipping sunk by American submarines up to the 1st of April 1942 ran up to a respectable 300,000 tons, that was only a quarter of what the war-wise Germans bagged during the same period. It was rough going, but those who knew the American submariner were not surprised at the rapidity with which the silent service shook itself down. For the submarine people made up for the lack of battle traditions by a rigorous selection of volunteers who were moulded into a skillful and enthusiastic corps. The promise of an early independent command attracted some of the more ambitious and intelligent young officers, and the probability of rapid promotion, excellent educational opportunities, and higher pay drew the cream of enlisted men. The fact that this service was both small and select made it even more than naval aviation and the Marines, a corps d'élite. Command of the submarine force was vested in a rear admiral, who exercised full administrative control, but only a limited operational control over his boats. Submarines were assigned to squadrons and divisions on the basis of locale and type. In the early days of the war, Admiral Nimitz preferred to direct submarine movements himself, but after the Battle of Midway, he gradually released control of the submarines to Commander Submarine Force Pacific, with whom he still kept close liaison. The United States was a signatory of the London Naval Treaty of 1930, in which Article 22 forbade submarines to sink merchant vessels without having first placed passengers, crew and ship's papers in a place of safety. Since that proviso made the use of submarines against armed or escorted merchant vessels impractical, and since it was assumed that Japan would arm and escort her merchant fleet in case of war, American submariners were not trained to attack merchant ships. The United States fleet's basic doctrine was, the primary task of the submarine is to attack enemy heavy ships. A heavy ship is defined as a battleship, a battle cruiser, or an aircraft carrier. On occasions, the primary task may, by special order, be made to include heavy cruisers, light cruisers, or other types of ships. Treaty and doctrine alike went by the board on the first day of the war, when the Chief of Naval Operations issued the terse order, "Execute unrestricted submarine and air warfare against Japan." The enemy, by his calculated breach of treaties and international law at Pearl Harbor, had absolved the United States from observing any rule restricting methods of naval warfare, unless dictated by self-interest or the danger of retaliation. After the 7th of December 1941, combatant ships were still considered prime targets, but the employment of submarines to disrupt the enemy trade now became of major importance. The American concept of submarines, dictated by our few and far-between bases, required that they be capable of self-sustained cruising for long periods over great distances. The building program followed these lines, so that the Navy entered the war with a preponderance of large fleet-type submarines, undersea vessels of endurance, reliability, and relative comfort compared with the smaller types favoured by European powers. These rugged vessels displaced in the neighbourhood of 1,500 tons. Variations from this mean tonnage were the smaller S-boats of 800 to 1,100 tons, and Argonaut, Narwhal, and Nautilus, which ran up to 2,700 tons displacement. The S-boats, distinguished by numbers instead of names, and most of them old enough to vote in 1941, lacked the seakeeping qualities of the big fleet subs. The Big Two, 700, tonners often doubled as mine layers and troop transports. The average fleet-type submarine was manned by a crew of 7 officers and 70 men. It had a cruising range of 10,000 miles and carried supplies for 60 days. Surface speed was 20 knots, submerged speed 9 knots. Underwater endurance at 214 knots was 48 hours, but if the boat lay on the bottom, it could stay down much longer. Power on the surface was derived from a diesel-electric engine and motor combination, while storage batteries furnished juice to the electric motors when submerged. Armament at this period consisted of 6 to 10 21-inch torpedo tubes, 1 3-inch 50-caliber deck gun, and 2 50-caliber machine guns. Some 18 spare torpedoes were stowed in the torpedo rooms fore and aft where the crewmen lived. Initially, all torpedoes were propelled by turbines, operated by hot gases resulting from the combustion of a jet of alcohol and compressed air mixed with steam. Later in the war, electric torpedoes, valuable for the absence of the telltale wake, were introduced. The warheads were loaded with TNT, intended to detonate whether the torpedo struck a target or passed close to the magnetic field of a metallic hull. Unfortunately, these torpedoes had grave defects in the depth control mechanism and the exploder, which did not come to light until the war was well along. The first caused torpedoes to run 10 feet deeper than set, usually so far under a ship's hull that the magnetic influence feature of the exploder was not activated. This exploder was a detonating mechanism fitted into the warhead before firing. It contained its own small booster explosive to jar the main charge into action. Oft-times the tricky magnetic device functioned prematurely, endangering the boat and doing no harm to the target. And the firing pin, supposed to function under physical impact, proved too fragile to stand up under a good, square, go-degree hit. Normally it would set off the charge only if the warhead hit a ship at an acute angle. Thus, the best shooting was rewarded by duds. At the outset, American submarines had no radar and relied on sighting targets by lookouts or detection by the sound-listening gear. An attack was made either by periscope observation or by tracking the target's propeller noises. This latter method never lived up to pre-war expectations. During 1942, an air search radar, the SD, and a surface search radar, the SJ, were installed. They notably increased the boat's effectiveness while adding to the congested conditions on board. Orders to the submarines were transmitted by radio from Pearl Harbor or Australia daily, but the boats were not usually required to acknowledge. They could send in important contact reports at the skipper's discretion, and the reports had to be important because radio transmissions were generally plotted by enemy direction finders. In 1942, the submarine patrols in the Pacific averaged 47 days at sea, half of which were spent going to and from station. At the end of its patrol, a boat was usually given a 2 weeks overhaul and upkeep at Pearl Harbor, where elaborate rest and recreational facilities were provided for submariners. After that came a week's shakedown before the beginning of the next patrol. Southwest Pacific submarines got neither the rest nor the overhaul until after several months of hard patrolling. Individual patrols were the rule at this period. We knew about German Wolfpack tactics, but had too few boats to use them so. In the internal organization of the submarine, the captain decided when, what, and how to attack. The execution of his orders depended on the crew, and the boat's success hinged on their intelligent precision, no less than on the captain's temperament and judgment. In a submerged daylight attack, the submarine closed the target from ahead, seeking a firing position from forward of the enemy's beam. The skipper in the conning tower acted as approach officer, giving orders for course and speed, number of torpedoes to be fired, depth settings and angular width of the spread. In order to avoid detection, he made only short and infrequent periscope observations. The periscope indicated the bearing, which was then transmitted to the target data computer. A range-finding device in the periscope also furnished data which went into the computer to cause it to indicate enemy speed. The submarine's bow did not need to be pointed in the exact direction in which the torpedoes were to swim. A gyro steering mechanism set itself to turn them to the proper track after firing. When the range was favorable, between 700 and 2,000 yards, the captain gave the order to fire. A sailor standing by pushed a button, and the first fish was ejected from the tube by a high-pressure air impulse. Immediately upon leaving the tube, the torpedo's engine went into action, driving a pair of counter-rotating propellers. Water rushing by the exploder mechanism turned a device which armed the torpedo after it had run 400 yards. The remaining shots were fired at 5-second intervals, in order to prevent the torpedoes from interfering with each other. The process was similar to duck hunting. Torpedoes led the target so as to hit and angled apart to produce a shotgun effect. The executive officer doubled as assistant approach officer and navigator. Another officer operated the computer. The tiny conning tower, containing 11 men, was crowded like a subway car in the rush hour and as busy as a bargain basement. Directly below the conning tower in the control room stood the diving officer, normally the same as the engineer officer, surrounded by scores of valves, wheels, buttons, gauges, and indicators. His job was to see that the boat took the required depth and kept the proper trim, down by the bow when diving, down by the stern when surfacing. Normally, the submarine contained only enough seawater in its ballast tanks to give it slight negative buoyancy. Its angle was controlled by the hydroplanes, massive metal fins projecting from bow and stern, hydraulically manipulated by men stationed at huge wheels in the control room. When the boat surfaced, high-pressure air forced the seawater out through ballast tank bottoms, and the planes were canted so that the submarine climbed uphill. Once on the surface, engineers in the maneuvering room shifted the source of power from storage batteries to diesel engines, opening the main induction valve to supply air. In submerging, vents opened in the tops of the ballast tanks, releasing imprisoned air and permitting seawater to come in through flood openings in the bottoms of the tanks. In these up-and-down operations, the diving officer kept a careful eye on the Christmas tree, a vertical panel of red and green lights, which told him at a glance the status of the hatches, valves, and other openings. Every inch of space below decks was utilized. In the forward and after torpedo rooms, men lived among their torpedoes. If there were not enough bunks to go round, the hot bunk system was used. A man coming off watch climbed into a sack just vacated by his relief. So close did submariners live to one another, and so dependent was each on the rest, that misfits were quickly spotted and removed by the captain. And relations between officers and enlisted men were much more intimate than in surface ships. The submariner, with his cramped quarters, long patrols, nerve-wracking depth charge attacks and ever-present possibility of a slow and unpleasant death by suffocation, liked the duty and frequently volunteered to make patrols rather than lie over for an earned rest, which might entail his transfer to another boat. He usually claimed that his duty was the safest in the fighting navy, but was mistaken about that. Post-war records show that 16% of the officers and 13% of the enlisted submariners in the Pacific were lost. Although carefully selected and volunteers, submariners were not a special type, but a representative group of young men. The personalities of successful captains in 1942, men like Fenno, Warder, C.C. Smith, Clackring, Burlingame and Brockman, were as divergent as the law of averages will permit. Some were quiet and scholarly, others were boisterous, hearty and cocky. All that they had in common, besides naval academy and submarine school background, were superior skill and aggressiveness, and a cool gambler's ability to calculate odds. All submarine activity in the Pacific Fleet was divided into two categories: special missions and patrols. The special missions included everything done in support of the fleet, as in the Battle of Midway, as well as operations such as mine-laying, rescue, and the raid on Macon. Patrols meant the normal cruises in search of enemy shipping. The Japanese Navy commenced hostilities with 60 submarines, only 13 fewer than the American submarine force in the Pacific had. Results should have been commensurate with this slight disparity. Yet, except during a few weeks of the Guadalcanal campaign, the Nipponese boats failed to accomplish what was expected of them either by the Emperor or by his enemies. A description of Japanese submarines and their doctrine and employment will help to explain the causes of their failure. Japanese submarines were divided into three general classes: 47 I-class fleet submarines, 13 RO-class coast defense submarines, and a small number of midgets. Displacements in the I-class ranged from 1,600 to 2,200 tons, the average being slightly larger than their American counterparts. Some of this type had been in commission for 15 years. Others, with the benefit of German design, were only a year or two old. Diesel engines drove them at the high speed of 24 knots on the surface, and electric motors gave 8 knots submerged. Cruising ranges at economical speeds ran from 10,000 to 17,500 miles, and a few of them had a sea-keeping endurance of 3 months. They were supposed to have a safe diving limit of over 300 feet, but the older boats never dared venture that deep. For armament, they had 6 to 8 21-inch torpedo tubes, mostly mounted in the bows, and carried 24 torpedoes each. On deck were either 1 or 2 guns of 5.5-inch or 4.7-inch caliber, and 2 to 4 anti-aircraft machine guns. 11 of the I-boats had an airplane hangar which housed 1 small float plane, 4 carried communication equipment for employment as squadron flagships, and 5 could accommodate a midget submarine apiece. The RO-class coast defense submarines varied in displacement from 650 to 700 tons, in age from 6 to 19 years, and the fastest could make 19 knots on the surface, 8 knots submerged. Both I and RO boats were equipped with sound listening gear, but none had radar. Midget submarines were built in 80-foot and 41-foot sizes, and carried 2 18-inch torpedoes. Their endurance was limited by the time it took their storage batteries to run down. Officers and men of Japanese submarines, always volunteers, were given a course of instruction at the Yokosuka Submarine School. During the first year of the war, training was good and morale high. The complements were about the same as in equivalent American craft. The fleet boats carried 60 to 100 men, the ROs 60, and the midgets 2 to 4. Neither the physical characteristics of Japanese submarines nor those of their crews explain their relatively poor performance. Japanese submariners complained that their boats were very slow to submerge and once below clumsy. They could not dive as deep as American boats, and lack of radar was a handicap. But they had 2 advantages which outweighed every deficiency. They could use a far-flung net of island bases to reach productive patrol areas faster than ours and stay there longer, and their simple, rugged torpedoes, equipped with a nearly surefire contact exploder, were very reliable. The pre-war Japanese concept of submarine employment was exactly the same as the American. The boats were to operate in support of the fleet, and their primary targets were enemy warships. To this end, the newest I-boats were organized as the 6th Fleet under Vice Admiral Mitsumi Shimizu. Only the older I-boats and some of the RO boats were portioned out to various area commanders to use in disrupting Allied supply lines. It so happened that after Pearl Harbor there was no enemy fleet to attack, and the fast-shifting carrier task forces were few and hard to catch. Yet, instead of sending most of their boats to raid merchant shipping, the Japanese persisted in trying to find warships. They had no scruples about unrestricted warfare, far from it. They simply failed to replace faulty strategic notions. And this is the more difficult to explain because the I-boats that reached patrol areas off California and Oregon shortly after Pearl Harbor sank several merchant vessels and alarmed the entire West Coast. Every time the combined fleet moved, a submarine scouting line called the Advance Expeditionary Force cruised ahead. We have already seen how badly the submarines did at Midway. They did much better, sniping at carriers during the Guadalcanal campaign, yet even so, costly errors were made. The rear admiral in command of the scouting submarines actually rode one himself, a gallant gesture which gave him only a periscope view of the operation. Every night the flagship would surface, and the admiral would issue radio orders to his gang, but his own information was limited, and the enemy could fix his position by radio direction finding. Contrary to the general American belief, he seems to have had no radio contact with the big 4-engine flying boats which often snooped American task forces. As the Solomon struggle grew more desperate, the Japanese, like the Americans, threw nearly everything that could submerge into the disputed waters. The Germans frequently urged their Oriental allies to employ their submarine fleet against merchant shipping, but they succeeded only in persuading them to dispatch a few boats on harassing missions in the Indian Ocean. The Japanese, logically enough, could not see what help that was to Dai Nippon. They withdrew these submarines, and the Indian Ocean was largely left to the German U-boats, which were allowed to base at Penang, Singapore, and Batavia. Much of Japan's submarine potential was wastefully diverted to special missions during 1942. The boats refueled big seaplanes on ineffective bombing missions, like the one against Oahu in March. They made long cruises to conduct nuisance-heavy shelling, as on Midway, Johnston, and Canton Islands. They carried scouting aircraft great distances to make reconnaissance flights of negative value, like the one to Seattle. But the mortal blow to a successful undersea war was the Japanese Army's discovery, during the Solomons campaign, that the boats could carry supplies to isolated garrisons. Thenceforth, more and more submarines were pulled off patrols to serve the Army with rice and ammunition. In January 1943, a cargo container was invented which fitted into a torpedo tube, and that started a rush to devise further means of using submarines as seagoing pack mules. The Navy hated that sort of employment, but it was overruled in Tokyo, and as American destroyers became more adept at sonar tracking, the Japanese boats found themselves in hot water even when submerged. Thus, while there were many faults in Japanese undersea warfare, one thing stands out like the rising sun misconceptions engraved in the topmost minds of the military and naval hierarchy. Better submarine doctrine could not have won the war for Japan, but employment of her boats against the vulnerable supply lines would have cost the Allies dear in ships, goods, and effort, and delayed the final outcome far more than did the fanatical last-ditch defense of indefensible islands. During 1942, the Japanese 6th Fleet was a fleet in being. American expectation that enemy submarines would learn better imposed the costly convoy system on the United States Navy, pinned down dozens of small craft to escort duty along the West Coast, and diverted valuable destroyers to escorting convoys from the West Coast and Panama across the Pacific. Later in the war, as contacts with enemy submarines fell off almost to zero, the number of escorts was cut down, and by 1944 unescorted armed merchant ships were crossing the Pacific with impunity. For patrol purposes, the ocean west of Pearl Harbor was divided into 4 areas: North and Central Pacific, which were covered by the boats of Rear Admiral Thomas Withers, Commander Submarine's Pacific Fleet, South and Southwest Pacific areas, in whose waters prowled the boats of Captain John Wilkes, some based at Fremantle, others at Brisbane. The most successful American patrol in the late spring of 1942 was made deep into enemy waters by Trout. This was her third patrol under Lieutenant Commander Frank W. Fenno. Trout departed Pearl Harbor the 24th of March, and a fortnight out arrived off the south coast of Honshu after fueling at Midway. On the 9th of April, 2 days after arriving on station, 2 small freighters were sighted, chugging along toward Kobe. Fenno could not get within a mile of them, but neither could he resist having a try at them because, as he later remarked, we didn't yet know that the woods were full of ships. Next day, Trout followed the trail of a long smoke plume to a slow steamer. 2 single torpedo attacks failed to connect, and the freighter with an escort chased the submarine so persistently that her sailors believed they had tangled with a Q ship. But Trout was as hard to catch as her finny namesake, and evaded her enemies. Next, a fat 15,000-tonner was sighted sneaking along the Honshu coast, her camouflage blending with the cliffs. Fenno got in 2 shots from a little more than a mile away. One of them hit, the ship's engines stopped abruptly, and she fell off course with whistle shrieking, but she was not fatally stung and escaped to seaward. Fenno could not surface and give chase because he was only 3,000 yards from an enemy shore battery, so he fired 1 more torpedo on an overtaking run, and it missed. Trout now moved southwest to cover the approach of Enterprise and Hornet, carrying the Doolittle planes toward Tokyo, so it was not until the 23rd of April that she returned to her old hunting grounds. This time she literally tangled with a Japanese fishing fleet and surfaced with 50 fathom of line and a large glass float wound around the conning tower. On the afternoon of the 24th, a 10,000-ton tanker felt the bite of 2 Trout torpedoes, but they stopped her only momentarily. A small freighter foolishly came to the tanker's rescue and attracted 2 of Fenno's warheads, one of which sundered her amidships. By this time Trout was hard by the beach. Fenno spun her to a reverse course, evaded a sub-chaser, and hauled clear. 4 days passed before she had another chance. In a midnight attack, she slapped a torpedo into a patrol vessel, which sank in 2 minutes. Later, as dawn was breaking, Fenno missed a cargo vessel, and 2 hours later a pair of torpedoes failed against a loaded tanker. Fenno was bewildered at the failure. The target should have been a sure thing. We can now guess why the torpedoes, set for depths of 35 and 39 feet, ran so much deeper that they had passed outside the magnetic influence field of the ship's hulls. On the 2nd of May, there was a repeat performance of a perfect shot, failing to hit a medium-sized passenger vessel. Fenno had no time to scratch his head over the miss before a 5,000-ton freighter was sighted. A second stern shot at 900 yards range cracked the vessel's hull like an eggshell, and down she went. 2 days later, converted gunboat Kongosan Maru was sent to the bottom off Honshu. The enemy retaliated with airplane depth bombs, none of them close. Trout now turned home, having fired 22 of her 24 torpedoes, observed 7 hits and sunk 3 ships. But this was better luck than most of his contemporaries had. Fenno modestly attributed this to the fact that his fish, which were on hand in Pearl Harbor at the war's start, were more reliable than subsequent issues. Many of his misses, he believed, were caused by the rule against firing spreads, which had been imposed to conserve torpedoes. Triton departed Pearl Harbor on the 13th of April for her 3rd patrol along well-travelled Empire sea lanes, and a good one it was. Her first stroke of luck came when, 10 days out and north of Marcus Island, she engaged with gunfire an enemy trawler after missing with 2 torpedoes. As this was their first gun target, the sailors made up for lack of practice with enthusiastic and rapid fire at point-blank range. It was night and black as the ocean's bottom, but 3-inch shells and .50 caliber bullets soon reduced the trawler to a tattered wreck. On the 27th of April, Triton entered the yellow waters of the East China Sea and commenced sniffing for game. 3 days later, she had a convoy at which she first fired 2 torpedoes. Both missed, and she came back to fire 2 more, this time damaging the 5,300-ton Calcutta Maru, whose escorts charged in for revenge, but Triton evaded them easily. That afternoon she did something very uncommon in those early days. She returned for another try at the crippled Maru. One fish passed harmlessly under, but the second finished her off. Triton took some periscope pictures for proof and then hauled clear. During the next few days, the primary menace was Chinese junks, fishing all over the China Sea and showing no lights. Kirkpatrick gave these a wide berth, as old China hands had been doing for 2 centuries, although for different reasons. During the mid-watch on the 6th of May, Triton came up astern of another convoy, missed the last ship in column, then surfaced, gave chase and sank Taiye Maru. Questing destroyers were easily evaded in the darkness. Kirkpatrick continued the hunt. At dawn he picked out another and larger Maru from the same convoy. But persistence in submarine circles has perils as well as rewards. The escorting destroyer went after Triton with a vengeance. The submarine crew were eager to experience a depth-charge attack and had their wish. They found the sensation unpleasant, but their boat merely had a few bolts loosened up. On the 15th of May, Triton's gun crew had an encounter with 2 Japanese fishing vessels. One of them, which put up a fight, was sunk. The other hove to and displayed a white flag. A boarding party visited the vessel and obtained a welcome load of fresh fish, valuable documents, and a Japanese flag. After putting the fishermen into a boat with food and water, Triton destroyed her prize. By this time, Kirkpatrick had become aware that something was going on in the South Pacific. At the same time, low fuel tanks prompted him to head east for a possible interception of enemy forces. Sure enough, on the 16th of May, south of Shikoku, he sighted a carrier and 2 destroyers, but was unable to catch them. Next day, Triton deprived Yamamoto of 1 unit of his advance expeditionary force. Cruising, submerged off Kyushu, she encountered Submarine 164 steaming complacently on the surface. Using the rising sun painted on its conning tower as point of aim, Kirkpatrick shot a torpedo into the enemy. Part of the hull was tossed 100 feet into the air, and some 30 survivors were left struggling in the water when the boat went down. Triton had no room to spare for these castaways and continued eastward. On the 21st of June, she fired 4 torpedoes at another surfaced sub, but failed to hit. And on the 4th of July, she steamed exuberantly into Pearl Harbor, where Admiral English remarked that good spirits and a successful crew went together. Submarine Thresher made a late spring patrol which did not match the tonnage score of Trout and Triton, but furnished plenty of thrills. On the 3rd of April, en route from Pearl to Japan, her crew were scared but unhurt by an enemy submarine torpedo whose bubbling wake passed close aboard, emphasizing that this sort of game can be played by both sides. As was customary in underwater guerrilla fighting, the 2 antagonists separated post-haste. A day later, Thresher aimed torpedoes at a merchantman. The fish appeared to be passing under, but there were no damage done to the enemy. The crew had until the 10th to grouse about that one, when their confidence was partially restored by a single torpedo hit, which split 3,000-ton Sado Maru in 2. The sinking occurred in mid-morning, and Japanese escorts held Thresher down for the rest of the day, dropping depth charges and inflicting incidental damage. While Thresher was dodging the enemy explosives, she unintentionally dove far deeper than had any American submarine theretofore. Yet the boat withstood the tremendous pressure easily. This was something worth knowing. Other boats used the knowledge in deep dives which left enemy depth charges growling harmlessly overhead. Shortly after, Thresher was cruising on the surface when a high wave washed green water down the hatches, doing more damage than had the depth charges. She had to curtail her patrol and head back to Pearl. She had fired 7 torpedoes for only 1 hit. Grenadier sank the largest vessel during the spring of 1942. She had been out from Pearl for nearly a month patrolling off Japan, when on the 8th of May she came on the 14 500-ton Taiyo Maru plodding south of Kyushu in a well-protected convoy. Despite her size, the ship was poorly compartmented, and 2 torpedoes sent her down like a lead sinker. The subsequent depth charging did no harm, and Grenadier was rotated to the midway action before getting any more game. Drum, Tuna, and Pompano were 3 other boats which made successful forays into the enemy's front yard prior to midway. At midnight, the 1st of May, Drum hit and destroyed seaplane carrier Mizuho off southern Japan. On the 13th, she chased a telltale smoke plume and plopped a fish into 5,600-ton Shonan Maru, and on the 25th repeated the performance on a smaller freighter. But 3 days later, a 5-torpedo spread missed a large naval transport, which made a zig just as the warheads left the tubes. Pompano started her patrol modestly by sinking a sampan. On the 25th of May, a fire broke out in her engine room. 2 hours after it was extinguished, she sank a small tanker. 5 days later, from a range of 750 yards, which was close for those days, she sank an 8,000-ton transport with 2 torpedoes. Some 24 depth charges in retaliation did not even touch her. On the 3rd of June, in the Bonins, she sank a small inter-island steamer and watched a boat from Iwo Jima rescue the survivors. After blasting a trawler operating nearby, she turned east to lend a hand at Midway. The May-June patrol of Silverside's Lieutenant Commander Creed C. Burlingame illustrated the difficulty of assessing damage in the early days of the war. On the 13th of May, south of Honshu, she claimed sinking an enemy I-boat, but it escaped. On the 17th, her crew were slightly embarrassed to find themselves towing a trawl buoy with a Japanese flag attached, but quickly proved they had not changed allegiance by attacking 2 Japanese merchantmen, one of which was sunk. 5 days later, Burlingame watched his torpedoes blow the bow off a naval auxiliary and make a hit under its bridge. There followed the usual depth charge attack, this one lasting from noon until supper time. The auxiliary was salvaged. Most of Silverside's patrol time was spent in hunting for the retiring Japanese Midway force. Greenling Lieutenant Commander Henry C. Bruton was dispatched from Pearl Harbor on the 20th of April to dip down into the Mandates. West of Eniwetok, she met a Japanese supply ship, fired 8 torpedoes for 8 misses, and started a gun action with the vessel, which proved so tough that Bruton had to break it off. On the 4th of May, north of Truk, the sailors were surprised that it took but 1 torpedo to send a 3,600-ton freighter to Davy Jones's locker. For the next month, the patrol was an irritating succession of ship sightings, including a carrier. Never did Greenling get within range, but she brought home some interesting photographs and observations on the Mandates to show the top planners at Pearl, proving submarine reconnaissance of enemy-held territory to be very profitable. So far, we have recounted adventures of some of the successful boats, those that came home with facsimile Japanese flags flying on improvised halyards. Other subs had not the luck to be at the right spots at the right times to make contacts. Yet every boat on patrol was a threat, and the Japanese, who had expected to be able to navigate their home waters in perfect safety, were forced to draw precious destroyers from the fleet for escort purposes. Many of the unlucky boats brought back valuable intelligence, and some, by their very failures, saved later patrollers from wasting time in barren waters. Cuttlefish made just such a cruise to the Marianas before Midway. An old boat with irascible engines, she could make only 14 knots. It took a long week out of Midway to reach Saipan, where the skipper reflected that his old gal had steamed over 15,000 miles since December, yet had sighted but 3 enemy ships. Nor were things better at Saipan. She had a brush with a small patrol boat, but was unable to sink it. She sighted cruiser Yubari, but because of her slow speed, could not get into firing position. Again, she sighted 2 destroyers and was manoeuvring to attack when a sleeper, an unseen 3rd destroyer, charged in, spoiled the attack and very nearly ruined Cuttlefish. Her final sighting, a tanker, she never closed near enough to shoot at. Twice she narrowly escaped aircraft bombs. On the 15th of June, this boat was back in Pearl Harbor without a single scalp. Officers and crew had tried so hard for a score that they were dispirited. We can now see that slow speed made her useless for aggressive patrol. The spring submarine offensive ended with preparations for the Battle of Midway, when 19 of the 26 submarines in the Central Pacific were called upon to support the fleet, and most of the others moved off station in vain efforts to intercept the retiring enemy. In April and May, Japanese shipping losses pushed close to 250,000 tons, a high total for those days. In May alone, more enemy ships were sunk than in the previous 5 months of war, and not one Central Pacific submarine had been lost or badly damaged. It was now apparent that ships in waters off the main Japanese islands were 2s thick as geisha girls in Tokyo, and as easy. ComSubPac therefore divided those waters into numbered areas in order of priority, with top billing given to the entrance to Tokyo Bay, followed closely by the passages to the inland sea. Midway now became a full-fledged submarine base capable of giving between patrol refits, shortening the run to the Empire by 1,100 miles. And in order to take care of the Marshalls and Carolines without taking boats off the Empire Run, it was arranged that submarines transferring to or from the Southwest Pacific Force should patrol the mandates en route, refueling at Johnston Island when necessary. Several boats had made the long transit between Oahu and Australia before the Battle of Midway, and one of these, Tautog Commander J.H. Willingham, demonstrated the profits. 2 days out of Pearl on the 26th of April, her officer of the deck sighted a Japanese periscope as the enemy was opening range to fire. The boat's rudder was put hard over, and the crew called to battle stations. One quickly fired torpedo sent the Japanese submarine down in a broil of orange-grey smoke and water. By a rare chance, a PBY on hand saw and confirmed the termination. In the Carolines, on the 16th of May, Willingham drove an enemy freighter onto the beach with a hole in its side. Next morning, I-28 was sighted on the surface, numerals and men on the bridge plainly visible. One torpedo disabled the Japanese, who retaliated with 2 shots which Willingham dodged. The duel ended when Tautog registered a second hit under the enemy's conning tower. On the 24th, Tautog snuffed out Shokomaru 4,467 tons. Admiral Lockwood received Willingham in Australia on the 11th of June with a hearty, "Well done." Stingray was one of the submarines to steam from Australia to Oahu as a regular patrol after Midway. Going north from Fremantle, she spent the month of June patrolling earnestly but fruitlessly off Timor, Davao Gulf, and San Bernardino Strait. Finally, she pointed her bow toward Guam, and after 3 days met a 3-ship convoy from which she cut out a 1,300-ton converted gunboat. Stingray escaped with minor depth-charge damage. Thresher, her relief, was running in the opposite direction during July. Lieutenant Commander William J. Milliken took this boat right through the Marshall Islands, damaging a tanker off Malolap early in the passage. On the 9th of July, at the start of the forenoon watch, Thresher was lying off Kwajalein in a mirror-like sea when a big motor torpedo boat tender, Shinsho Maru, stood toward the lagoon entrance. She sank the tender handily and dove deep as a patrol plane cracked the water viciously with a depth bomb. Nearly 2 hours later, Milliken and his men, serene over their easy victory, were jolted by 2 more airplane bombs very close aboard. Shortly after this, a strange buzzing noise was heard, followed by a sinister banging and clanking on the hull as some metallic object scraped it fore and aft. While all hands were speculating what this might be, suddenly the stern rose, pitching the boat to an alarming angle. Thresher, like the shark she was named for, had been caught on a hook, a giant grapnel which the Japanese were towing on the end of a heavy chain. We can well imagine the consternation of the crew. The skipper even ordered secret codes destroyed. For 10 heart-fluttering minutes, Thresher writhed like a fish being played by an angler, running in fast, tight circles. Finally, the grapnel was shaken loose, but the Japanese were soon back, this time with a score of well-aimed depth charges. One even bumped the conning tower. Next day, the crew discovered what had given their position away. The first aircraft bomb had caused a small leak, which emitted a stream of bubbles that could easily be detected breaking on the calm surface. An excellent lead for the Japanese fishermen. Nothing more happened until Thresher arrived off Truk. On a dark, squally night, the sound operator reported propeller noises a quarter of a mile ahead. The officer of the deck cautiously brought his rudder left. Suddenly, out of the rain and darkness, appeared a large patrol craft pounding toward Thresher at high speed. Milliken backed emergency and ordered a dive. The Japanese skipper was so confused that instead of continuing on his course and ramming, he turned hard right. Presently both vessels were steaming parallel, only 150 feet apart. The Americans topside watched Japanese sailors running about the deck and even heard them shout. But Thresher was comfortably cushioned with seawater before the enemy woke up and started shooting. Milliken's next close-up occurred off the Netherlands Indies on the 4th of August when he attacked a small freighter, which turned out to be a scorpion with depth charges in its tail. He had a narrow escape as the ash cans swished and boomed all around. But Thresher carried her good luck into Fremantle Harbour, which she entered the 15th of August after a 7,200-mile voyage. Gudgeon Lieutenant Commander W.S. Stovall, which had already sunk a Japanese I-boat, made a normal passage through the mandates. Off Truk, she made a few inconclusive attacks and received some desultory depth charging in return. On the 3rd of August, she put 2 good torpedoes into a 5,000-ton freighter. Several days later, she claimed damage to 2 large transports and paid for it with an hour of heavy depth charge attacks. Passing between Celebes and New Guinea, Gudgeon arrived Fremantle the 2nd of September. The Pearl Harbor Fremantle shuttle had proved a paying line. By midsummer, many of the boats were making their 3rd or 4th war patrols, and the effects were being felt by the crews. On Greenling's 3rd patrol, the skipper observed that the men most susceptible to illness and infection were those who had been longest in the business. Almost all submariners suffered from headaches, constipation, and colds. In the tropics, old hands developed ugly skin ulcers. Vitamin pills, sun lamps, air conditioning, and fresh frozen foods improved health conditions to some extent. Comsubpac planned to relieve 1/3 of each crew after each patrol, but many skippers and their men were reluctant to comply. The men would volunteer to stay in a boat they knew, and one which would eventually get a stateside overhaul. The skippers naturally liked to keep trained sailors. There were many areas around Japan which no American submarine had yet penetrated, such as the coastal zone off northeastern Honshu. In early August, Guardfish Lieutenant Commander Thomas B. Clackring departed Pearl on her first war patrol, bound for these unfished waters. On the 19th, she had her first whack at an auxiliary, but the torpedoes exploded prematurely. Clackring refrained from the usual deep dive in order to get in a shot at a pursuing destroyer. The destroyer was so inept at tracking that no contest resulted, but Clackring's boldness later became doctrine. Going after a heckling escort was apt to be safer than accepting a depth charge attack. On the 22nd of August, Guardfish gun crews engaged an armed trawler, touching off its cargo of fuel oil to make a spectacular fire. Next day, the performance was repeated on a sampan. On the 24th, a 3,000-ton passenger Maru was steaming out of harbour when 2 Guardfish torpedoes splintered her from hawse-pipe to stack. She stood briefly on her nose and took a deep dive. Guardfish shifted her locale frequently in the next few days and had one disappointing set-to with a freighter in which defective torpedoes played a part. On the 2nd of September, she sank a 2,300-ton freighter, but her real payoff came on the 4th. In the late afternoon, she hit 2 ships in a convoy within a minute. One went down stern first, the other bow first, while excited submariners took turns squinting through the periscope. Less than an hour later, she fired a long single shot at a freighter entering Kuji Bay. This remarkable shot from a range of nearly 4 miles took 7.5 minutes to reach the end of its journey, where it blew out the vessel's midship section and left it wallowing in the mud. And yet the day was not done. Before another hour passed, Guardfish sank a 4th ship, almost in the same spot. At all times she sailed almost within scraping distance of a rock-bound shore. The next 5 days Guardfish spent evading angry patrol craft. On the 15th of September she entered Midway Lagoon with a broom at the masthead, having fired all but one of her 24 torpedoes for 11 hits and 8 sinkings. Clackring modestly attributed his success to the fact that Admiral English had given him permission to try for contact hits rather than under-the-keel magnetic explosions. In August and September, Haddock, another new submarine, was the first to carry on patrol the modern SJ radar, which in submarines corresponded to the SG in surface craft. Unfortunately, her patrol area to the westward of Okinawa contained little shipping at the time. She had but 7 enemy contacts and sank 2. Eventually, the SJ radar was to make night attacks and wolfpack tactics highly profitable.